The bus. I don't think I've ever met anyone who likes taking a bus across country. Buses are crowded, they have long layovers, and for some reason, it always seems to take longer to get anywhere on a bus than it does for any other form of transportation. Not to mention, if you've never ridden a Greyhound or something for a very long time, you might not know this, but they are incredibly difficult to sleep on. I have always had problems sleeping on them when I'm traveling, and often I would go days on a long trip with little to no sleep at all. But that is not the worst thing to happen to me while on a bus. I once had a really frightening experience. I had been in California for a few weeks. I was between places to live. I had a room waiting for me near the college I was going to attend in the fall. However, the lease on the room didn't start for almost a month after the lease on my current room had ended. In order to have a place to live, a friend of mine let me stay with him and his roommates in California for a month. When it was time for me to go home, I bought myself a bus ticket. The school I was going to go to was in Illinois, so I was going to spend over 3 days on that bus. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I was lucky for the first leg of the trip. The bus I was on was not crowded, and I was able to have my seat and the seat next to mine all to myself. That made it easy to sleep on the first night. However, the following afternoon, we made a stop. I don't recall what city it was, but so many people got on that bus, and it was totally packed. I knew that wasn't going to make it too pleasant. The guy who sat next to me was a bit weird. He was also one of those people who didn't seem to know very much about personal space. That made me nervous enough. I mean, I'm a guy, which I should get out there. I didn't think he was a guy who was trying to come on to me or anything. He was just one of those people who would sit next to you and didn't care if his body parts ended up being in your personal space area. He also talked a lot, and he was one of those people who seemed to have no idea how loud he was talking. I'm sure you know the type. They are loud and even say private things very loud. I'm sure most of the time when he spoke, everyone on the bus would hear what he was saying. I mentioned the talking because of something that happened when we were driving. He leaned forward to grab a drink out of his bag. When he did, I could see inside his jacket, and he had a hunting knife, or what I assumed to be a hunting knife, strapped to it. When he sat back, he must have seen the shock on my face, and realized what I had seen. And for the first time since he'd gotten on the bus, he lowered his voice to a whisper. "Oh, don't worry about that," he told me. "I've just carried it on me for as long as I can remember." We stopped not long after that. Before getting off the bus, the man asked me where I was going. I told him, and he didn't respond back to me. He just left. Now, I mentioned how much I hate riding buses, but I didn't mention how often I have done it. I, in fact, have ridden cross-country buses dozens of times. So many times that you think that I would have gotten used to trying to sleep on them. But every part of what follows had never happened to me before. The driver of the bus was talking to someone on his phone, and after he did, he began to pull the bus to the side of the road. He announced to everyone that we were having a technical issue, but it was nothing to worry about. He was going to pull over, and everyone would have to get off of the bus. Right at that moment, the man sitting next to me got up and walked back to the back of the bus. He went into the bathroom. I just figured that he likely had to pee before getting off the bus. Everyone got off the bus, and when we did, I noticed several police cars behind the bus. I was surprised because I hadn't heard any police sirens, so I had no idea what to think about what was going on. But I did notice that the man who was next to me was still not off the bus. Officers went on the bus, and after a long while, they came off the bus. The man who was next to me was being let out in handcuffs. One of the other officers was holding the knife in a bag that I'd seen strapped to him. They put him in the car, and we were allowed to get back on the bus. My first assumption was that the driver had seen the knife on the man and called the police about it. Well, I was way off. The man was wanted in connection with a murder in the area that he had first gotten on the bus. He needed an ID to buy a bus ticket, so the bus company had his information. The police were able to get in touch with the driver, and the technical problem announcement was a ruse to get us off the bus safely. It's a little scary, knowing you were sitting next to someone who might be a killer. But the details of the story make it scarier. The man had originally bought a ticket to Kansas, but he changed the ticket to the town in Illinois that I was headed to at the stop where he had asked me where I was headed. The murder victim was a random person. It was not someone that he had known in any way. And that was the scariest part for me. Normally, if someone is going to just commit one murder, it will be someone they know. They will have a motive for doing it. If someone kills someone that they don't know, they are doing it for the kill. And that is the behavior of serial killers. Although we will never know, this man might have been a serial killer in the making, albeit a stupid one for giving his real information to the bus company, and by changing his destination, I may have been his intended next victim. I am very happy that we will never know the answer to that. The alley. Ever just been in the complete wrong place at the complete wrong time? I guess we all have at some point. However, my experience could have ended up being a lot worse than it eventually was. This happened late on a very cold night. I live in the city, which one I won't mention, but I moved there right upon moving out of my parents' house. I went to school at a college in the city, but I maintained my own apartment. It was an efficiency apartment, you know, one of those apartments that is basically a dorm room. There was one room and a bathroom with a small kitchen set in the main room. It was winter break from school. I planned on spending part of the break, the time around Christmas, at home with my parents. But after that, I preferred to be back in my own apartment. Well, even then, however, being so used to campus life and being around people all the time, I was feeling pretty cooped up and alone. And I also wasn't getting the regular amount of both physical and mental stimulation I did while school was in. So I began sleeping very poorly. One night, I had tossed and turned for a long time, not wanting to give up on the possibility of getting to sleep. However, by about 2 a.m., that was too frustrating for me to do anymore. I got up and thought about watching television, but that wasn't enough for me. I decided that maybe I should go for a walk. I don't mind a cold walk as I like cold weather. And it was not only really cold that night, I realized it was lightly snowing too. However, this didn't bother me in the slightest bit. I headed out for my walk. I had been out for a while, and the streets were pretty dead because of the cold. After I had had my fill of walking around, I headed back to my apartment building. The cold was beginning to get to me finally, so I thought I would slip through some alleys in order to get back to my apartment as soon as possible. I slipped through into one of the alleys, cutting the way back to my apartment. I normally didn't like doing that at night, but it seemed like there was no one outside. The homeless community normally would be riding the trains at night, if they could have train fare, back and forth, in order to keep warm, and they really would have needed to keep warm that night. And I went down another alley, and I was surprised as I went on, because in this alley, there was a homeless guy in it. He was laying up against the wall of a building, by some trash cans. My first instinct was to just walk by him, and when you live in the city, as long as I have, you have to sometimes ignore homeless people. And I know it sounds harsh, but you can't help everyone in the world. But as I got closer and closer to the man, I began having questions about him even being alive. He didn't look like he was breathing or anything, so I actually got a bit concerned. I approached the man, cautiously, trying to see if he was alright. I still couldn't tell if he was breathing when I leaned in and said, "Hey there, are you?" I didn't get a chance to finish my question. The still man became extremely unstill. He jumped at me and something cut my arm. It only took me a second to realize the man was holding a knife, and he got me good on the arm. The guy was still much weaker than me, and he was likely very, very cold and frozen, and I just ran out of the alley as fast as I could. He didn't follow me. Rather than go back home, I had to go to the emergency room. I got stitches and a tetanus shot. It was still light outside before I was able to get home, and finally get to bed. Late night. When I was a teenager, I began getting a lot more freedom to do what I wanted. I wasn't really held to a curfew or anything like that. I normally didn't even have to tell my parents I was going somewhere before going. They just didn't seem to worry about me. I guess there were both good and bad implications about that. Well, when you're younger, and in a situation like this, I guess it makes sense that you might try and bend rules a little more and more each time, seeing how much you can eventually get away with. And by the time I was a senior in high school, even though I was only 17, I was sometimes taking the train to the city and spending the night there. My parents really didn't seem to notice. On this night, it wasn't anything like that though. I was just over at my friend's house playing video games. We played pretty late into the night, and it was very late by the time that I finally began to get tired. When I decided I needed to sleep, my buddy offered me to sleep over there, but I declined. I was tired, and I knew that I would only feel comfortable if I was home and in my own bed that night. So even though it was late at night, I decided to just walk home. My buddy lived across town from me, so it was a bit of a walk, but I didn't mind. In fact, I had gotten so used to walking around at night that I would occasionally take walks late at night just to be doing it. I enjoyed the loneliness of it. I think maybe my favorite part of the walk was when I walked through the park. It wasn't lit very well, and it was really, really dark. So I was able to sometimes walk through it at night and maybe freak myself out. Yeah, I'm one of those guys. I like to be scared, and it doesn't normally happen by watching movies or listening to videos on YouTube. And don't get me wrong, I really enjoy watching both of those things, but they don't scare me. It was probably around 3 o'clock in the morning when I was headed into the park. I went walking through it, and it didn't take very long until there was so little light that I could barely see where I was going. Fortunately, I had walked that path many, many times before, and the path I was walking on was asphalt, so I could hear my own footsteps on it. Not long after I'd been into the really dark part of the park, I have to admit that there was this part of me that really regretted doing it. You know how it is. You always want to scare yourself, but the few times you succeed, you begin to regret doing it. It's always a weird feeling for me, and it wasn't any different this time. My eyes would dart quickly from left to right. There was little light, but I tried my best to still be aware of my surroundings. It was hard not to imagine things in the darkness that really were not there. And of course my imagination was kicked into high gear. There were also, of course, noises, too. There were crickets and frogs, and the normal nighttime noises. And those were fine. But then I heard a noise that I hadn't expected. There were footsteps on the asphalt. I was pretty sure they weren't mine, too. However, I tried to tell myself that they probably were. My mind was of course playing tricks on me, because I put it in a position to do such. But it did sound like someone else was walking on the path with me. Now, even if there were, I guess that wasn't something to really be scared of. I mean, really, I couldn't always be the only person walking around late at night all the time. They might hear my footsteps and be as freaked out as I had been with them. I stopped for a moment. I wanted to make sure that I was hearing someone else's footsteps and not just my own or my imaginations. And when I stopped, I heard footsteps not far behind me continue to fall. I was about to tell the person, "Hey!" But before I had the chance to, I felt fingers from behind touch me on the back of my neck. They moved forward just a little bit, but there were definitely two hands, and they were both touching either side of my neck. I didn't even know why I responded like I did. I completely lost control of my body and I took off at full speed. I ran like I'd never run before. I didn't even think of looking back. I just ran and ran. I ran out of the park. I ran down the next street. I ran into my neighborhood, and I didn't stop running until I reached my house. And the entire time I never looked back. Not one single time. I simply ran all the way home. Once inside, I locked the door and holed myself up in my room. I don't really know what happened, but I do know that experience changed me for a while. I didn't walk out in the dark for quite a while, and I didn't try to scare myself for quite a while either. Sick day. When I was 16 years old, I had this day where I got very, very sick. I wasn't the type who wanted to stay home from school. I never faked being ill, and normally, even if I was feeling sick, I would still do my best to make it to class. Yeah, thinking about that right now, with everything that is going on, I realize what a dumb thing that was for me to do. Fortunately, if anything, current conditions have taught me that if you're feeling ill, be considerate to other people and make sure you stay home. But the point is that it took a whole lot of convincing to get me to stay home from school. And this was that I was certain that in class, if an emergency had come up, I would not make it to the bathroom in time. I had two siblings. They were both fine and went to school. My parents worked, so I was going to be home by myself for the whole day. They made sure I had some things in my upstairs bedroom that I might need. Plus, they promised to check up on me as the day went by. When I had gotten up that morning to get ready for school, before I knew I just would not be able to make it, I noticed it was really dark outside. We had some storms that were moving in on us that day. I figured, if nothing else, I would be able to get a lot of good rest that day. I am one of those people who tends to sleep very well during storms. So after my siblings went off to catch the bus and my parents headed out to work, I curled back up under my blankets and just did my best to go back to sleep. I figured that I fell asleep right away. I woke up some time later. I couldn't tell you when exactly. The power had gone out, and it was absolutely dark in the house. The storm must have been raging for quite a while, and was still going on strong. Not thinking too much of anything, I decided to simply go back to sleep. I turned over on my side and pulled the blanket up over my head. I hadn't been lying that way for more than a few moments before a loud shattering of glass completely woke me up. I sat up in bed. The sound had come from the first floor of the house. I think the first thing that went through my mind, which might go through anyone's mind, is the possibility that the house was being broken into some way. It's easier to think of the scary things before the not-so-scary stuff. But then I also realized that there was quite a storm going on outside, and that a tree branch could have broken a window, or maybe some item getting caught in the wind struck a window. So for a few minutes I calmed down. However, I did keep listening in case I would hear something, anything else. Even rationalizing what you hear doesn't always take away the fear and precaution, when the only sounds I heard were from the storm. So I accepted the fact that it was simply a branch or something. I figured I had to get up and go clean up or something, so the house didn't get too much water in it. I got up and put my slippers on. I was still a bit groggy at the time. I walked out of my room and made my way down the hallway towards the staircase. I stopped in utter shock when I saw a man that I didn't know walking up the staircase. He was looking down at something in his hand. He didn't seem to notice me at first. However, that was just one long moment of terror before he looked up and saw me. He looked surprised at first, maybe just as surprised as I was. He honestly must have believed no one was home, and for a moment that seemed to last for a really long time, we just stood there and looked at each other. I broke first, turned, and ran back into my bedroom. I locked the door, went and grabbed my phone, and then ran into my bedroom closet to call the police. The closet door didn't lock, but at least the bedroom one did. I couldn't hear what the intruder was up to over the sounds of the storm, but fortunately I could hear the police sirens. The police arrived and found me in the closet. The intruder was nowhere to be seen. From what the police figured, the intruder left when he realized someone was home. But that doesn't make his presence in my house, an uninvited presence, any less scary. Bullied. I was watching this show the other day about bullies. The worst part of it, in my view, was that it showed the parents of bullies discussing it. I found it shocking how many of these not only downplayed what their children have done, but often blamed the bullied child for the bullying. So although I don't really like to talk about this story very much, I felt it was very important for me to share it. I was bullied very badly in school. It started when I was in the 6th grade, when I was still skinny and wore glasses. I didn't have many friends and was a bit of a bookish sort, and, as is the case, there were several boys who singled me out for bullying. From the onset, these other boys made my life a living hell. The way only a bully seems to know how to do. For the most part, I was able to escape the bullying unscathed because it would happen at school. My school had really strict rules about the consequences of fighting, and risking a fight was also risking possible expulsion from school. But bullying doesn't have to get physical in order for it to be traumatizing. This was the summer between grades 7 and 8. I was still small and was still having problems with these people. But summers were mostly good for me. I never saw any of those boys after school, so I assumed that they didn't live anywhere near me. On this day, I was out taking a walk in our large neighborhood. My parents were at work, and I'm an only child. I walked down to one of the parks, which was empty, and this wasn't unusual, really. I went to the wooden jungle gym and took out a pad and paper that I had. I often liked to write outside, which was often also a magnet for bullies. After a bit, the wind picked up and it was noticeably cooler. I had been in a writing zone and hadn't noticed that a lot of the black clouds had been moving in. It took only a few moments before the lightning and thunder began, and I realized if I didn't get home as quickly as I could possibly get soaked. And if my notepad got soaked, I would lose pages and pages of writing, not just from that day. So I got up, and I was just about to jump off the jungle gym. That was when I froze because I saw 3 kids that I knew from school, and they were 3 kids that bullied me more than any others. I wasn't sure what to do at first. They hadn't seemed to notice me at first, but they definitely would if I got up. However, they were walking up towards me from the other direction that I had to go, so I could get out of there and get back home as quickly as possible. A loud crack of thunder caused me to jump. I decided I needed to get home as quickly as possible, so I got up and I jumped off the jungle gym. And that was when I heard one of the boys yell at the other ones who I was, and yeah, they came right after me. Fortunately, I was a decent runner. Not only that, I didn't live that far away from the park, so I just booked it towards my home. I looked back and a few times saw the bullies were coming after me, and also it began raining. Now I mentioned that I think the parents who defend their bullied children have a weird way of thinking. Well, it turns out, so do the bullies themselves. Running toward the sidewalk, I turned back. It had already been raining for a bit, but not pouring yet. I noticed one of the bullies, who I will call Dan for this story, slipped on the wet ground. He fell face forward onto the ground. His 2 friends stopped to help him up. For me, I thought nothing more of this than a lucky break. I ran across the street and was able to get into my house, locking the door behind me. I was safe from the bullies, and felt a lot better. However, when I looked out from the front window, I saw that the bullies hadn't given up. They were running towards my home. I suddenly thought about the back sliding glass door, which was often left unlocked, so I ran to the back as soon as I could, and I locked the doors. Again, for a short moment, I felt relieved, and that was when, with the backdrop of the storm behind them, the three boys appeared at the back door. Dan's face was bloody, and he had blood on his shirt. But that wasn't what worried me about him. The look in his eyes was downright psychotic. He was swearing at me, calling me every horrible name I'd ever heard, blaming me for what may have been a broken nose. And that is the bully mentality that I was talking about. I mean, the only reason he had a broken nose was because he was bullying me and chasing me down. Yet it was my fault in his mind, and he wanted me to pay for it. Dan tried opening the sliding glass door, and even though he knew it was locked, he kept pulling on the handle. It was as if he thought he was strong enough to overpower the lock. He strained, doing everything he could do to try and break the lock with the sheer force of his strength. His face was red and he was groaning, sounding like what he was doing was causing him a lot of pain. I looked at his friends and they actually looked scared of him. "I'm gonna get you, your ass is grass," Dan yelled at me as he let go of the door handle. He then started looking around. The entire time I was stunned, too stunned to move or know what to do. But suddenly I realized I was in my house, but that didn't make me safe. I quickly called my dad up on the phone. He told me to call the police, that he was on his way home. I called the cops. Dan was still looking for something in my yard, and that's when he grabbed a shovel. As he took the shovel in his hand, it was obvious that he was going to try to break the sliding glass door. His friends had had enough, but instead of trying to stop him, they just ran off. Again, typical bully mentality, only thinking of yourself. Dan hit the window, and I expected it to shatter on the first shot. I was surprised that it cracked a bit but didn't break. I guess maybe it was because the glass was thicker? I really don't know. But fortunately for me, my dad didn't work too far away. In just a few minutes he was able to get home, but not before the glass shattered. At that point I had gone into the basement of the house and locked myself in it. There were a few bangs on the door before I finally heard the voice of my father, yelling at Dan. There were some scruffling noises, and I wasn't sure at first what was happening. I was worried the maniac was hitting my dad with a shovel. But soon, it was my dad knocking on the door. He asked me if I was alright, and told me it was okay to open the door. Upon opening the door, Dan, who was a big guy, was laying face down on the floor. My dad was holding his arms behind his back. The shovel was laying across the room, and I assumed my dad, who was also a big man, knocked it out of Dan's hands. The police came and got Dan. I had to explain to them that Dan's bloody nose was caused by the fall. He actually lied, and told the cops that my dad had broken his nose. However, even Dan's friends later confirmed that he had fallen down. Dan was a minor, only one grade ahead of me. So we spent some time in juvie, not in jail. After he got out of juvie, I was terrified. Dan showed me that day that he was not mentally balanced. I completely expected him to attack me, despite the consequences to himself. But to my surprise, he didn't. I don't even know why, but he didn't ever bother me again. He also stopped hanging out with those friends. Maybe because they didn't lie about his broken nose? Who knows? Who cares? Bullies are just awful people. I will never understand why people would want to treat others like they do. But watching that show with the parents defending bullies made me think back on the experience. Dan blamed me for his broken nose, which meant he blamed me for running away and trying to protect myself. That means on some level he believed I should have not tried to get away, and I should just submit to some bullying. That was a very, very long time ago. I hope in the decades that pass that bullies may not be this bad. However, I doubt it. Shelter. I've always really enjoyed taking very long walks. From as early as I can remember, I like taking them. This has continued into my adult life as well. But when I was a kid, taking a walk was always my favorite thing to do. Of course, when you walk as much as I did, you are certain to occasionally run into some bad situations. I was 13 years old when this happened. The day had started out rather beautiful, and I decided to take advantage of it. It was in the early spring, if I remember it correctly. I went walking through town, and then down a road that led out of town. It curved back up, and then eventually it intersected with another street that I can turn on that led me back to town. While I was walking out of town, just enjoying what I was experiencing, I heard some rumbling off in the distance. I looked up in the sky to see what was going on, and off to the right of me I saw a storm approaching rather quickly. Like anyone else, I hate getting caught out in the rain, so I hoped I could make it back home, or at least back to town before the storm began. At least in town, I could take shelter at a shop or something if need be. But as I walked along, it seemed more and more unlikely that I had any chance of getting back to town, so I decided to cut through a bit of abandoned property in order to make it through. There was an old building on that property that I knew was abandoned. I can't say I know exactly what it had been when it was open, but I had been over in it before. I figured that although I didn't want to be in an old abandoned building during a storm, that it was at least better than being out in the storm itself. I did make it to the building before it began raining. I pondered for a few moments whether this meant that I had a chance to beat the storm back to town. However, during those few moments, I noticed that it had begun raining. That more than answered my question for me. This was a nasty storm, and I was soon happy that I hadn't gotten caught out in it. Fortunately, the glass in the window I was watching it from was not broken out. I would have been soaked. The wind was vicious, and the rain was slamming up against the building. The lightning, in fact, actually seemed like the less threatening part of the storm, really. I was sitting in the hallway, at the entrance door to the building. Looking out, I kept wondering to myself how long I was going to be in that building. Little did I know that my question was very soon to be answered. Despite the sound of the storm, I heard some noise behind me. Turning around, I was shocked to see that I was not the only person in the building. There was a staircase probably a good 15 yards away, and I noticed that someone was walking down the steps. He must have seen me because I had seen him, and I barely caught a glimpse of his face as he pulled the ski mask down, seemingly to cover up his identity. When the man got to the bottom of the stairs, he simply stood there for a moment, looking at me. It was the creepiest thing. He didn't say anything. He didn't indicate that he wanted me to leave, nothing. He simply stood there, but I knew he was looking right at me. And that was when he reached into his jacket and took out what appeared to be a handgun. I didn't need much more than a creepy guy in a ski mask and a handgun to tell me I had to get out of that building right away. The storm was still raging outside, and as I opened the door, I went out into it. I was immediately soaked in water. The rain hitting me was painful, and the sheer force of the wind nearly knocked me over several times. I didn't care. I was more scared of the guy in the building than I was rain, and so I got as far away from him as possible. I don't know anything about what that guy may have been up to. He may have been squatting there. He might have been using the building for some sort of illegal operation. I really didn't know, and honestly, I didn't want to know. All I do know is that he obviously didn't want me in the building, and I was more than happy to grant his wish by leaving. Walking home. Listening to a lot of scary stories let me know how just plain awful some people can be. And it's hard for me to understand why so many of these people are the way that they are. So, I thought I would share an experience with you that happened to me. I cannot to this day even begin to understand why the person involved did what he did. I lived way out in the country when I was growing up. My family was also pretty poor. When I wanted to hang out with friends from school, I often had to take very long walks to and from their homes. Using gas for non-essential trips was not something my family did very often. So walking down country gravel roads was something I did quite often. When I was 13, I had a really scary experience. My friend Jack had gotten a Nintendo Entertainment System for his birthday. This was around 1990. My family had an old Atari 2600, so that was really all I got to play for video games. And so I spent a lot of time over at his house that summer playing video games. And really, it was a completely new world for me. On this one day, I spent the entire day and the entire evening over at his house. We were playing Castlevania, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, a Super Mario Brothers, and all sorts of other games all day. And before I knew it, it was midnight. Normally, I would have just slept over at Jack's house. It was something I had been doing often anyway. But I had to be home in the morning because we were leaving early to go to church, which was something that my family deemed essential. And they would not be coming to Jack's to pick me up. I had to leave and walk home. This was a several-mile walk. It could take me about 2 hours to make the entire thing. And the walk was mostly on gravel roads, surrounded by thick woods, and lighted by nothing but the moon. So I walked down the paved road that Jack lived off of. There was a small convenience store where I turned onto the gravel road that led home. I mentioned this because I was surprised to see someone on the porch of the store. That store had been closed for hours, and I had never seen anyone hanging around outside it before. I think I stared at the man just a little bit too long, which some people consider to be the worst thing. He stared back, but I really could not make out what his facial expressions were. It was way too dark. However, he did get up at one point, and I took that as a sign to not stare at him anymore. I walked past the store and turned onto the gravel road. At this point, I was trying to not look at the guy, but I have to admit I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. The man walked over to the side of the store, and he was watching me as I was walking. He actually went all the way onto the gravel, and that was the last I looked at him. I just kept walking until eventually I was out of sight of the store. Now, being away from the man at the store was only a little bit of a small comfort. I was now walking down the gravel country road in the complete darkness. The trees were dense, and I had a long way to walk without any kind of light. I did eventually get used to the dark, and was able to at least see where I was going and to see the trees. But it wasn't the greatest sight, and I also saw things in the shadows that I knew could not be there. The scariest thing that I ever read was a scene in the book Pinocchio. It was when the puppet was walking through a dark woods, and two murderers lurked in the dark. They attacked him, but he bit one of them and got away. But the scene scared me, and I often thought about it when I was walking through the woods by myself. And there was no doubt that I was thinking about it on that very night. Thinking about the murderers hanging out in the darkness in the woods, invisible because they are protected by the darkness and the trees. My stupid brain shouldn't have focused on that, I know. But that is what your brain does when you are in a situation like that. I just tried my best to put it out of my mind. As I was trying to think of something funny, or at least not scary, I heard a crunching sound behind me. That sounded definitely like someone walking on the gravel. I stopped walking, and heard them walking still. They weren't very close to me, but it was quiet that night. with nothing but the normal night sounds around us. "Hey, is someone there?" I asked, squinting and trying to see something in the dark. I got no answer. And then I thought about the scary guy at the convenience store. I was already scared from my own thoughts, but this just made it even worse. I tried not to think of that, but I just listened to the crunching on the gravel. After a small amount of time, though, the crunching stopped. That wasn't comforting, though. That was just creepy, and it made no sense. I kept waiting for a little while to see if the sound would come back, but it didn't. So I turned and began walking home again. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but it was quiet for a while. But among the crickets and sounds of other bugs and animals, I began hearing another sound. It was still behind me, but this time it was coming from off the right side of the road. It sounded like someone was walking around in the forest. I just hoped that maybe it was a deer or something like that, but it didn't sound like it. When you lived as far out in the country as I did, you knew the difference between someone walking in the woods and a deer walking in the woods. I knew it was someone who was still a bit behind me, though. My first thought was to pretend I didn't hear it. I don't know why, but it seemed in my mind that acknowledging the last time gave away that I knew someone was following me. And whomever it was must have moved into the woods because of that. So I just kept walking. As I walked, I was hyper aware of the sound of the person who was walking around in the woods. And I got more and more nervous as the sounds kept getting closer and closer to me. I stopped for just a moment and knelt down. I grabbed a handful of gravel off the road and put it in my pocket. I grabbed a second handful and held it in my hand. While I was standing back up, though, I realized that there were no sounds other than the noises of the night. And I realized he must have heard me stop, and stopped too. I wasn't sure what my next move should have been. Should I start walking again? Should I just stand there? What? I was about to take a step when I heard a voice coming to me from the woods.
"I know you saw me at the store,"
it said, in an obvious attempt to not only disguise his voice, but to sound scary. "Leave me alone," I replied, scared. I didn't realize my mistake.
"Now, I know exactly where you are,"
he chuckled. Then I heard noise coming from the woods. He was coming at me. I took the handful of gravel and threw it in the direction of the noise. I threw another handful and another. When I finally heard a yelp of pain, I threw 2 more handfuls at it, and then I turned and ran. But I didn't run on the gravel. I ran into the left side of the woods, and I quickly found myself a really good hiding spot. There was a pine tree, and I was able to easily climb into it. I was still scared, and I realized I had to remain as still as possible. Neither of us had a flashlight, and it was still very dark. I hoped the gravel had hurt him enough that he didn't hear the direction that I had gone in. I did hear some rustling in the trees a little while later, but it eventually went away. And once it was away for good. I don't know how much time had passed, but I figured enough had passed that the guy was gone for good. So I quietly climbed down from the pine tree. Instead of walking on the road, I walked on the side of the road. It made my footfalls considerably less noisy. I was hyper aware of all the noises around me, waiting for a sound of a man walking around in the woods or on the road. Those noises never came, thank God, and I kept walking until I eventually made it back to my home. We had a long driveway, and I really wanted to just run quickly down the driveway to the house, but I went quietly. Everyone in the house was asleep. I quietly got into the house and got into bed, and it took a long time for me to go to sleep. When I got up, I told my dad about what had happened. He gave me one of his hunting knives and told me to carry it on me, and if it happened again, gut the guy. That was sort of the kind of guy he was. I mean, if the guy had come up to his house, he probably would have gotten a shotgun down his throat. I never had an experience with the guy again. The convenience store had been robbed, and I told the owner about what I saw, but it didn't help. I never got a good look at the guy, so I guess I can't tell you that I never saw him again. If I did, I would have no way of knowing. The Scare. I have a very unconventional extended family. My Aunt Carol has gone through a lot of boyfriends and husbands in her life, but the only really long-term one that I remembered was a guy named Norm. He was an okay guy, but was really the sort of guy who was always getting into trouble. His money always came from drugs or from illegal schemes with his friends, and the money was never much money. Like most people in my family, his family didn't have much money. I think every time I visited his family, they always had a new place to live. One of the times I visited, the scariest and strangest thing to ever happen to me in my life occurred. I guess he was building a house. There were several people building houses in the area, which was just on the edge of a large forest. But his family was living in the unfinished house. This is important to know, because the living room of the house was facing the forest, and the couch was placed under a window facing the forest. Well, it wasn't really a window, since no one had put the glass into the window yet. So at night, it was a pretty scary place to sit. I stayed there for about 3 nights. On the first night, Norm, and I had to respect him for trying, attempted to scare me. I was sitting on the couch under the window, and we were watching horror movies. He excused himself, saying he was going next door to get some beer. In reality, he snuck around the window, facing the forest, and he was going to jump through the window and scare me. Well, it didn't work for several reasons. The first is, the leaving the room in an attempt to scare someone was my ploy. So when someone did that, I always figured that them leaving the room during a scary movie was just a ploy. Plus, I was sitting under a huge hole in the wall facing a forest, so to me it was obvious what was going to happen. So when he grabbed me through the window, I simply responded with, "Hey, Norm." He was disappointed but not surprised. I mean, he knew I was so into horror and scary stuff that it may have been obvious. I did tell Norm that my mom was coming over tomorrow to spend one last night here before moving on. She had only begun watching scary movies after her and my dad got divorced, and she would get scared. He should try to scare her. So the next night, this all happened. This was 1991, for reference, so movies took longer to come out on video. I think we watched Child's Play and Flatliners that night. We had everything set up so that my mom would be sitting under the window. We knew she would be scared, because horror movies were never her thing. She had only been watching them for a short time. When he was ready, Norm excused himself. He said he was going to the house over yonder to borrow some cigarettes. Well, he got up and left the house. I saw him circle the house and walked into the woods. His plan was to make some noises in the woods to get my mom's attention. Then he was going to wait until she was involved in the movie again, and then he would sneak up and grab her. Well, the first part of the joke went perfectly. We all heard noises out in the woods beyond the window, but everyone but my mom ignored it. We told her it was probably just the wind, and she was working herself up because of the movie. So we told her to go back to watching it. When we got immersed into the movie again, We all waited and prepared for the big scare. And we waited. And we waited some more. We kept waiting for Norm to come and do the scare. We all started thinking that Norm was trying to put us all on edge. If he could scare all of us, he would have the last laugh. We waited until the first movie was over. We put in the second. We kept waiting for Norm to make his move, but he never did. My Aunt Carol excused herself and told us she was going over to the other house to see what Norm was up to. I knew she was going into the woods to see what was taking Norm so long. I even saw her go into the woods, and she eventually emerged without Norm and then came back into the house. Carol was frantic and told us Norm was gone. She explained the joke to my mom, and that alarmed us all. Us older family members went out and looked for him. We never found him, and I've never seen Norm again. Like I mentioned, he was into a lot of illegal things, so it wasn't really a surprise that something may have happened to him. It could have been drug dealers or something like that. Those noises we heard in the woods might not have been him trying to scare my mom. It may have been a real struggle. A struggle that resulted in my sort of uncle disappearing forever. Camping. I had a really terrifying experience camping one time. I was in a public park, but there were not a whole lot of people there, so I was able to find myself a nice and really sort of private area to set up my tent. I have to admit that while I love the woods, I have always been slightly scared about going deep into them. Fear of getting lost and that sort of thing. So being in a public park was very comforting. One afternoon, I drove down to the local grocery store in order to get some supplies that I needed. And on the way back, I went by a local bar, and I thought it might be nice to stop in for a drink. I had really been by myself for nearly a week at that point, and although I didn't know anyone in the bar, it might be nice to just be around people for a little while. I spent a little time at the bar, just looking around at people and having a light drink. I was watching some guys play pool. I didn't really even notice, though, that I may have been watching too closely. And I guess one of the players got a little irritated at me for watching. The guy wasn't very big. I mean, he might have been even smaller than me. But when he walked over to the bar, he tried to intimidate me. "You got a staring problem, man?" he asked me as he ordered a drink from the bartender. Looking at my Amaretto Stone Sour, he remarked, "I guess you're a fag drinking shit like that and staring at me." I assured the guy I was just watching a game of pool. I even told him if it bugged him, I wouldn't watch. However, he just kept pushing me. I began getting irritated with him and finally lost my cool. He pushed my shoulder, then I pushed him off of me and he fell over the bar stool. In anger, he got back up and pushed me hard. He tried grabbing me, but the bouncer in the bar had already come over. He grabbed the guy and pulled him out of the bar. Although the bouncer didn't put his hands on me, he told me that I had to go also. We were both out in the parking lot as I got into my car to leave. The jerk got into his car and followed me, but when I turned into the camping site, he did not. He drove past, and I honestly thought that was the end of the whole story. I spent the rest of the day and evening forgetting about the incident, and by the time I went to bed, I actually felt comfortable again. I was able to fall asleep really easily. It was a weird sound. I was sleeping in my sleeping bag in my tent, and that noise that woke me up was unfamiliar and very weird. But it wasn't alarming. I just decided to turn on my light and see what was going on. Upon turning on the light, I looked up and immediately saw a silhouette of someone standing outside of my tent. Also, there was the tip of a knife slowly cutting through the fabric of the tent. When the light came on, the slow cutting became a faster ripping. I reacted the only way I knew how. I had a stun gun in my tent for protection. Grabbing it, I lunged at the shadow cutting into my tent. I hit the trigger, heard the zapping sound, coupled with a loud yell, and followed by the thud of someone falling on the ground. Getting out of my tent, I was not at all surprised to see the man from the bar laying on the ground. The stun gun completely knocked him out. I ran off to get camping security, and they called the police. The next time I saw the guy, he was being led away in handcuffs. Strange man. I never thought that hiking could be scary. I really didn't. I know that there are a lot of scary hiking stories online, but honestly, when I went hiking, there were just things that I couldn't relate to the tellers of these stories. For example, I don't find the woods scary. I don't find the incredible darkness of the woods scary. And when I run into other hikers, I hadn't ever experienced any weird or scary people. Most everyone out hiking is pretty normal. So, when I finally had a scary experience hiking, I knew it was something that I would definitely have to share. I was extremely surprised, and having had it happen to me then made me more apt to believe other stories as well. I work a Monday through Friday job, so when I take a vacation, I get the 5 days off, plus the weekends before and after. So I have 9 days to do whatever it is that I want to do. So this time, I took off for a good and long camping and hiking trip. I wanted to go to an area that I had never been before. I picked a place up in the Appalachian Mountains. I had to fly into the local area, and then rent a car to drive out to a hotel. The following day, I went out into the area that I was planning on exploring. It was scouted out, so I had a map that showed me exactly where I needed to go. Being an experienced hiker, I was very good at following maps of the wilderness. Now, although I have mentioned coming across people in the past, when I have been hiking or camping, it really wasn't something that happened very often. I've just been camping so much in my life that me experiencing it, even in a vast minority of trips, still added up to me experiencing it several times. And all the people I've met, for the most part, just wanted to get on their way. This happened on the third night that I was out hiking. That was also one of the reasons it was odd. I had already set up my camp, and it had already gotten dark out. Definitely no one should have been hiking out after dark. I was sitting around my fire when I heard some noises in the woods. I was prepared in case of an animal, but I quickly saw a man emerge from the woods into my campground. There was nothing unusual about the man either. He was just like any other camper I have come across before. So other than the fact that he was wandering around the woods at night, there really wasn't anything odd about him. I invited the guy to come and sit by the fire with me. I gave him a couple drinks from a bottle that I brought with me. I found out that, like me, he was an avid hiker. However, unlike me, he had hiked and camped in the local area many times before. All in all, we had a really good time just chatting. After that, he said he was going back to his camp, and was happy to not only have met me, but having the opportunity to chat. The following day, I didn't come across anyone. It was just a normal hiking and camping day. However, the night following that, as I was camping, the guy then again came across my camp. He gave me some cliches like, "Oh, what are the odds?" and things like that. It really wasn't that strange, since we were both hiking in the same area, but it was a bit weird that he was acting like it was so unlikely that we would have come across each other again. So I let him sit by the fire with me for a second night. We had a nice time again, and after a while, he excused himself to go back to his campsite. Now, I have to admit, after a bit, I got a little curious about this guy, so I decided I would see if I could find his campsite. I took my bottle of whiskey with me, because I figured I could tell him I just wanted one last drink before going to bed, to explain why I followed him. I walked around in the dark a bit until I heard some people talking. And when I did, I recognized one of the voices as the man I had seen for those 2 nights. Well, of course I was curious as to what they were talking about, so I decided to eavesdrop a bit. And to this day, I'm very happy that I did. "Yeah, he should be asleep soon," the voice I recognized said. He had quite a few shots of whiskey, but hey, if he wakes up, then we'll just have to deal with him another way. "You sure he's got anything worth stealing?" the other voice asked. "Well, at the very least, I'm sure he's got some credit cards in his wallet," the first voice replied. "If he goes missing for a while, he can't cancel the cards, can he?" I knew they were talking about me, and the words were terrifying. I tried to go back to my campsite as slowly and quietly as I could. I got into my tent, and going through my packs, found my unloaded gun and my bullets. I mentioned I'd been a hiker for a very long time, and I knew that a hiker had to always be ready for trouble. Rather than going into my tent, I went and hid behind a tree, and I waited. Eventually, I heard noises and knew that the 2 men were coming towards my campsite, but I waited until I could see them, and that is when I slowly came out from behind the tree. They were looking in my things and didn't notice me at first, so I fired a warning shot. When they saw me and saw the gun, the 2 guys immediately bolted, dropping my things. Now, you probably think this is the end of the story, and it wasn't very scary since I was the one with the gun. Well, you'd be wrong. I scared the men off, yeah, but that didn't mean they wouldn't come back again while I was sleeping. So I had to stay up the entire night watching, and they could have come back from any direction. And who knew if they had a gun of their own or not? So yeah, it was a very unpleasant night. As soon as daylight hit, I packed up and made my way out of the woods. Well, even though it would take days to get myself back to the area with my car rental, the map showed me how to get to a road, and once I did, I hitchhiked back. I didn't feel safe, really, until I was sitting in my rental car. Camp. I used to live in a town for about a year when I was in the 6th grade. It was easily the worst place that I had ever lived in my life. I guess being a small and sort of bespectacled type, I not only had a hard time making friends, but became the target of quite a lot of bullying. Although I had experienced it before, it was actually much worse in this town than anywhere else. There was a trip that the school had every year at the end of the year for 6th graders. It was a weekend trip to a summer camp. We would only be there for 3 days, and nearly everyone was looking forward to it all year. I, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with it. I wasn't much of an outdoors kid to begin with, but going there would mean I would be spending 3 days and nights with the bullies from school. Evenings and weekends were my time away from these people, and going to camp meant I would be giving that up. However, my parents seemed to think that I should go for my own good. I had no idea what that meant, but I really couldn't argue with them, so I went. I have to admit at first that it didn't seem so bad. Hell, in fact, it seemed like I was more accepted by the other kids at first. In fact, we had a really fun time the first night in the cabin I was assigned. We played a game of Truth or Dare, and I did get a few dares in that got the attention of counselors, although no one got in trouble. So after that first night, I really thought that maybe things were going to get better for me. Well, on the second night there was a dance. I absolutely had no interest in having anything to do with the dance, so although the entire camp was there, I decided to stay behind at the cabins. I was much more comfortable being alone. After a while, though, I noticed some of the other boys headed out of the area that the dance was taking place in, and back towards the cabin area. Although I felt a little more accepted the night before, I definitely still did not feel like I was a member of the group. So I thought before anybody could see me, I would head off into the woods for just a little bit, I wanted to avoid whatever these boys might try to do to me with no adult supervision around. I went out onto the hiking trail. I had been on it once before, when we had a scheduled nature hike. It was quite long and branched off a few times, and after taking a few different branches, I actually managed to get myself lost. And not only that, but it was very late when I headed out, so now it was completely dark, and I was very scared. And that is when I was grabbed from behind. I noticed quickly that it was the two kids I saw leaving the dance. They were the two kids I knew that bullied me a lot. One was holding me, and the other began taunting me. "Well, look who we have here, and with no one around," one of the bullies said. "Thought you'd have fun off in the woods?" the other said, the one who was holding me. The one who was not holding me took out a switchblade, and I was frozen in fear. At that point, I couldn't even hear what they were telling me. Both of these boys had gotten into fights with me at school, and they were strong and scary guys. And now there was no one around to help me. No teachers at all. I was terrified of what might happen to me. The one with the knife came up close to me. "What part should I cut first?" "You're not going to cut me and get in trouble," I responded, trying to sound brave. "I won't get in trouble if they never find the body," he responded. Yeah, that was exactly not what I needed to hear. "What the fuck is going on here?" I heard a female voice say. The boy with the switchblade quickly put it away, and that's when I saw one of the female counselors, who I knew was a sophomore in high school. "Let him go," she demanded, and the boys automatically did. "You guys are so fucking dead. I knew you were up to no good when I saw you head off into the woods. Get your asses back to camp right now and give me the damn knife." "My father gave it to me," the boy protested. "Unless you want your father picking you up from the police station, you better give me the knife now," she demanded. And that was all it took, and he handed over the knife. The counselor then marched us all back to camp. She took us to the teacher's cabin, where I had to tell everything that happened. And then, I actually had a fun time watching those two boys get bitched out. Now, you might think this made the bullying worse, but it didn't. Both boys got expelled from school for their actions, and I never saw them again. Well, that's not completely true. When I was writing the story, I got curious about them, so I looked them up. Both are in prison. So maybe that's a word of warning to any bullies who might be listening to this. You should change your actions now, because you never know where you're going to end up. Tab Trailer. My scary hiking story happened to me when I was 13 years old. My family had just recently moved to a very rural area. I was more used to a suburban sort of area. But unlike a lot of people who go from a more city-like area to a more country-like area, I was excited about the change. Not only was it just far more beautiful, there happened to be just a world of things that I could experience that I never had before. Our house was beautiful and was on a hill. It was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Honestly, it was the first time I'd ever seen barbed wire, and I was even interested in that. Fortunately, however, I was smart enough to avoid the barbs whenever I went over the fence, and I didn't get barbed. At least I figured that's the verb I was looking for. The thing that I enjoyed the most about living in that area was going on nature hikes. They didn't have hiking trails or anything like that. The vast area was owned, I believe, by the people we had bought the house from. I would often go out and explore the area, encouraged by my parents to do so. I guess they both grew up out in the country and would go on little hikes of their own. One day I decided I was going to go out and take a nice long trip for the day. I got up early in the morning, put some supplies in my backpack, and I headed out. I really wanted to get a taste of what it was like to feel like I was really going on a real hike, rather than just doing a little bit of exploring. I came across some really neat birds and other wildlife that normally I didn't see. And that was cool because the forest had some of the most colorful birds I'd ever seen in my entire life. But when I went further and further into the woods, I eventually came across something that really shocked me. Looking down the hill I was on, I saw a really little tab trailer sitting at the bottom of the hill. You know what I mean. It's one of the small, egg-shaped camping trailers, one that isn't drivable, and you would have to hook up a truck in order to take it anywhere. Of course, there was no truck in the area, and I didn't see a way for a truck to even get there. And a part of me thought I should just ignore it and go on. I mean, if someone was actually living in it, then I would just be disturbing them. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it would be unlikely anyone lived there, so I decided to check it out. I made my way slowly down the hill. It was a bit steep, as I recall, so I had to be extra careful on my way down. As I got to the bottom of the hill, I began to creep around the trailer. I wanted to check it out and see if there were any signs that someone lived there. But looking around, it really didn't seem like there was. The whole thing just looked really deserted. In case someone did live in the trailer, I thought it would be the best idea to go up and knock on the door. However, I did this slowly as well. Although I was confident that no one could be in the trailer, I was still a little scared. I mean, an unexplained trailer out in the middle of the woods. It could contain anything. As I began to get close enough to knock, I got the shock of my entire life. The door to the trailer slammed open. And what I mean by that, it was thrust open with so much force that it hit the trailer wall and almost closed up again. But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was the person I saw standing in the doorway of the trailer. I mean, he was the nastiest looking person I had ever seen. He had matted hair and a beard that was matted and caked in filth. But that also wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was the knife he was brandishing at me. The man stumbled down the little steps outside the door, screaming and hollering. I mean, he was talking so fast and wasn't making much sense. But that wasn't what was important. What was important was that he was coming at me with a knife. Nearly at the last moment, I gained my composure. Turning around, I began running away from the man. I turned back and he was still coming after me. I had no idea why, because he still was just talking loads of gibberish. Now, fortunately for me, though, this was an old and haggard hermit, and I was a 13-year-old boy. I was able to run fast enough and far enough that eventually I couldn't see nor hear him behind me. However, I kept running until I wasn't able to run anymore. When I got back home, I explained to my dad what had happened. He sort of shook his head and told me I needed to be more careful. There were some hermits he had come across in the area that he had grown up in. Most of them just wanted to be left alone, and he told me that the hermit, likely, was just trying to scare me away. You know, I guess that's possible, but if it was, why did he keep chasing me? I think he was interested in more than just scaring me away. The house. I had a very difficult upbringing, and things really never got better with my parents. I grew up feeling like they resented me. I mean, compared to my older brother, I guess I was just a disappointment to them. He was one of those all-around perfect kinds, you know. He was an athlete, he was good at class, and he was basically pretty popular. I had no interest in sports or being popular. I was actually better at him when it came to grades. That didn't seem to be the most important thing to my parents. My older brother was still the golden boy because he was just perfect all around. Being 2 years older than me, my brother was out of the house when I was 16. He went off to college. They left me at home with my parents, and that wasn't pleasant. Things just got worse, and they kept comparing me to him over and over again. And nothing I did was ever good enough, and my parents began trying to force me to get a job. Keep in mind that they had never done this with my brother. It wasn't really anything to do with money, though. It was quite obvious that my parents were just constantly trying to get me out of the house, so they didn't have to deal with me at all. It didn't take too long before I just couldn't take it anymore. There were no positives living at home anymore, so I decided to leave. I didn't even tell them I was going, and honestly, I wondered whether or not they would even notice. I just left. For a while, I was staying at the houses of some of my friends. However, that couldn't last very long in any way. I was 16 years old, and technically it wasn't legal for me to be staying in their houses. So after bumping back and forth from friend's room to friend's room, I soon found myself staying with a guy who used to be buddies with my brother. He didn't go to college, and he was just sort of a slacker. So I stayed with him for a month or so. However, he eventually got thrown out of his apartment, and after that, I had my first real experience living out on the streets. I went to the city because of homeless shelters. Hell, I remember my first time ever in a homeless shelter. It was the scariest experience I'd ever had in my life. Hell, I even remember crying. But as terrible as it was, at no point did I ever consider going back to live with my parents. It was bad where I was, but it would have been much worse in my view to go back. Homeless shelters were pretty okay. The only thing that was difficult about them were how strict the rules were. They had very specific times that you could be there, and also hard set times when they would no longer let anyone in. This occasionally caused issues with me because I would be out trying to get money so I could get some food. And more than a few times, I ended up not getting back to the shelter in time. I did end up finding a place though. It was an abandoned house that many people squatted in. It definitely was not as good as the shelters, but it was definitely also something that was good when I had nowhere else to go. I'd slept in train stations and alleys at times, so it being in an actual building was good. However, there was drug use there, and I really wasn't interested in that. I was more concerned with getting sleep when I was there. Anyway, I had a really terrifying experience in the house one night. I had missed the deadline to get into the shelter. It was really cold that evening too, so I had no real choice but to go to the house. It was gonna be more crowded because of the cold, but I was fortunate to find a corner that I could sleep in. I had been carrying a pillow and a blanket in my backpack for a while, so I was able to go right to sleep. It was still dark when something woke me up. I wasn't really sure what it was, but when my eyes adjusted, I saw a very scary looking man standing over me. He was angry looking, and his eyes bored holes right through me. "Why have you been doing it?" he asked me, in a voice that was literally dripping with hatred. "What?" I began to ask, having no idea what he was talking about. "You are going to die," he cut me off. "But before you do, you're going to tell me why you've been doing it." Why? Being told I was going to die by a scary man in the middle of the night in a squatting house just floored me. I was so terrified that I wasn't even able to respond. I was trying to make sense of what was happening. I wasn't even able to wonder what it was he was talking about. I was just too scared of him in general. "You're gonna tell me why before I kill you," he suddenly said, much louder than he had spoken before. And then he also grabbed onto my shoulders and began to shake me, screaming, "You're going to die!" Well, the commotion obviously caught the attention of other people in the room and the house with me. A few other guys came over and pulled the guy off of me. He kept struggling with them and told them that they were going to die too. However, they were able to easily overpower the guy, and they threw him out of the house. He stood outside, screaming at the house, and that was bad. If someone were to call the police, everyone could have been arrested. I left the house the back way during the commotion. I had enough change that I was able to get on the subway and just rode that back and forth for a while. After that, I could never go back to that house. I was way too terrified to even consider it. You might like to think that I went home after all of this. I didn't. Although the experience was terrifying, I just couldn't bring myself to go back to my parents' house. This actually happened 15 years ago, and I'm still estranged from them. I get along great with my older brother, who helped me get a GED and convinced me to eventually go to college. So I'm in a good place with a good job now. So that much is good. But it's weird. I will never know what that man was talking about. I will never know what he thought that I did, or even if he really thought I did anything. He seemed like he was in a lot of pain, and was angry over something. All I know is that it definitely was not something that I did to him, and I will never know what it is. Room. I guess before I explain what happened to me, I should explain why it is that I ran away from home as a teenager. It had a lot to do with the man that my mom decided to marry after her and my dad got divorced. My dad was no prize himself. He was a bit of an asshole and even bordered on being abusive. He would spank to cause pain when I was much younger and would not stop until his kids were absolutely bawling. My stepfather never hit us, but he was still awful in other ways. He yelled at us for no reason. He would get up in the middle of the night on school nights and play music really loud that woke us up. We would feel terrible at school, and our mom just chose him over us again and again. I decided that I had to leave, but I didn't do it by just getting up and leaving during the night. I actually had a plan. I got a part-time job and saved up some money. So then, the plan was that once I had the money where I could go and find a place to stay, and then hopefully get a job, I would leave. That way, I wouldn't have to sleep on the streets, like a lot of runaways end up doing. After several months, I bought myself a bus ticket and headed to LA. Yeah, I guess it is kind of cliche. But I thought that it was a good place for me to try to get away to. Once I was there, I was able to get a really cheap room in an old building for a really cheap price. I was able to lie about my age and get myself a little job. All in all, it seemed to me that I made the right decision, that I did a good job in getting myself prepared for it too. Things worked out pretty well for a while, but the building I lived in was not really a safe and quiet place. I had to begin sleeping with earplugs. That was the best way for me to get rest, and the plugs blocked out the noise. But one night, while I was sleeping, a series of gunshots woke me up. That had been something I hadn't heard before, and it completely brought me out of sleep and put me immediately on edge. It sounded like it came from the hallway. I was too poor at the time to have a phone, so I couldn't call 911. I didn't know what to do, really. My door was closed and locked, of course, including a bolt lock. But I was still extremely worried. I just decided to not indicate that I had been woken up. I did not turn on any lights and I did not move. A few moments later, there was a thumping on my door. It wasn't someone knocking on it, but it seemed simply like someone was trying to open it. And although that was terrifying, it didn't last very long. I did my best to just not make a sound. I didn't move again until I heard the police sirens. Well, I didn't move after that either. It wasn't until the police actually knocked on the door that I moved. And I moved and opened the door. And although it was just a moment, I did see a person lying in their blood in the hallway. The police came in the room to talk to me, so I didn't see much. It was the murder of a resident of one of the other apartments, but we didn't know by who or why. I had to move out of that place. I actually found a motel that was cheap enough and rented me a room at a monthly rate, but I couldn't remain in that building after that experience. So as things went on, I eventually went back to school. I made a life for myself in LA, went to college and got a good job. I did make up with my family, although I never moved back in with them. We get along today quite well. Tent. You know, it seems like in a lot of runaway stories, very similar situations play out. Now, I'm not criticizing that, so I need to explain what I mean. When teenagers run away, they spend time with friends or they go to the cities and are homeless there. And that makes perfect sense because those are obvious options for somebody who is running away from home. I ran away from home as a teenager. My experience was a whole lot different, however. I'd been camping a whole lot in my life, and I had my own camping gear. I was a good fisher and knew that if I left and went through some rural areas, forests and such, I would be able to survive pretty easily. So my running away from home was sort of like a very long camping trip. I won't go too much into the reasons why I left. It was just strong problems with my parents. They were trying to force me into things that I wasn't interested in doing. And after putting up with that for so long, it just got to be too much. So one morning, after the two of them had gone to work, I packed up my camping gear and went on my way. I had picked the perfect way for myself to leave home. I was happy. I stayed out in the hills and in the woods. There was plenty of fish for me to catch, and the nights were clear and warm. I didn't come across any other hikers, and if I did, I could pass myself off easily as nothing but a hiker. My tent was put up close to a creek, so the water I needed was right there, as well as the fish. So it was pretty good. I'd been living out in the woods, camping for a couple of weeks, at the point in time that this story really takes place. I woke up one morning and came out of my tent. My attention was immediately drawn to a tree that was directly in my line of sight. I was shocked to see that someone had taken a fish and nailed it into the trunk of the tree. I was killing fish every day for food, but this was just weird and sickening. It also meant that someone had been in my campground while I was sleeping. That wasn't totally weird. This was a creek, and other campers might need to use it. But it was just odd that they were only there while I was sleeping. It did something so pointlessly cruel to an animal. There could be only one reason to do it, and that was to intimidate me, and that just wasn't a good thing. I didn't let it bother me for the moment, however. I took the fish down and went about my day. I walked around and tried to find any evidence of other people around me. I wasn't able to find any other campsites or something like that. I didn't find any people, and didn't really see anything that led me to believe there were other campers around. Now, by the time I had gone back to sleep, I had all but forgotten about what had happened. I chalked it up to nothing but a simple hiker who came by the camp while I was sleeping and decided to play a mean joke. So I wasn't really worried when I went to bed that night. Well, by the next morning, I realized I had to start taking it more seriously. There was yet again an animal nailed to the same tree when I woke up. However, this one was a dead rabbit. Now, the only thing I can say is that it is fortunate, and I did know for sure, that the rabbit was not killed as it was nailed. That would have woken me up without a doubt. But this was obviously a statement, and I had to take it seriously. I took the rabbit down, and I buried it too. And then I packed up my things and went hiking far out of my way to find a different campsite. I went all day and got very far from the area I had been in previously. I found another nice creek before nightfall and made my camp. I slept well, thinking I had given the animal nailer what they wanted by leaving. And the following morning, I came out of my tent to see a squirrel nailed to a tree. I was shocked. I'd hiked an entire day away from where this had been happening before. So I wasn't invading the same person's area. There was no way. And it also means that he had to follow me, some way, for an entire day without me knowing about it at all. If this was a message for me to get out of the area, I had to take it very seriously. If I didn't, I may end up getting nailed. So I hiked down to the road and walked along it, hitchhiking. I eventually got picked up and was taken a long ways away. I didn't go back home, in case you were wondering. I found a public campground a long way and stayed there for a while before moving on. I lived for several months camping and I was cool with it, But eventually I did want to get back to society. I found a job and worked my way up in the world. I now have a really great family, and I can provide for them very well. If I hadn't left those woods, that may not have happened. So I took the hint